Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Jim Kleiber Show. Today is Tuesday, September 29, 2020, 1 o'clock in Eastern Time Zone, and today we have a presidential debate tonight. It is the first presidential debate in 2020. Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and I was very careful to say, not to say Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, because I think some of this political language can be so competitive and divisive that it doesn't necessarily bring us together. So I am hoping that it'll be less of a debate and more of a dialogue where people can learn from each other and try to bring the country forward together. I doubt it. It's being framed as the heavyweight championship of the world, and I just hope that it could be a little more cooperative. I was talking with my parents about it, and it's almost like watching, for you Americans out there, it's almost like watching a Michigan versus Ohio State football game and thinking that after the game, the Michigan fans are going to say, you know what, I've become an Ohio State fan. I really doubt that a vast majority of people watching are going to, quote unquote, switch sides. But wouldn't it be nice if they could have a conversation where it wasn't about sides, it was about actually resolving conflict together instead of just blaming each other? Gosh, how much I yearn for something like that. So today on the show, we have a good friend of mine and a man I highly respect named James DAngelo. And I really look forward to the conversation, talking about politics, talking about transparency, talking about Congress, talking about how to get rich people to pay more taxes and why they don't pay taxes, and divisiveness, and many of these topics that almost might be the symptoms of something else. And I think James has done a lot of research on these things, and overall, I just really enjoyed talking to James. So he'll be on in a few minutes here. I'm playing with the idea of doing a short monologue and then inviting him in. So what I like about what James talks about is there's an elegance to it. And I'm a person who really likes simple solutions that have very large impacts. And I think when we look at what's happening politically right now, we like to blame individuals instead of looking at the systems that are causing them to behave in certain ways. The laws, the culture, the rules, the norms, things we've talked about before on the show. And when I heard James speak, it was last year, 2019, at a political conference in Nashville called Unrig, I just really appreciated how much he was focusing on the little changes to the system that could have large impacts on many different aspects of what's going on with politics right now. And it felt so refreshing to me, because I think a lot of times I look at what's happening in the political conversations on TV and on the internet, and so often they really don't seem to pay attention to the environmental factors, and they don't pay attention to the internal emotional factors. They just seem to say that people are evil, and that's the end of it. Like, these people don't care about you. They never cared about you. They never will care about you. And so therefore vote for me because I care about you. I mean, it's such a overplayed trope that it really bores me and frustrates me. And I think what I like about what James talks about is a little more about how to humanize the people in office in the Congress, congressional members, and try to understand why they're making the decisions that they're making instead of blaming them for the decisions that they're making. And this is an overall approach and attitude I have towards life, as much as I try to remember, is to not blame the person for what they did, but to try to understand why did they do that, and perhaps there's something that we could change so that they don't do it again. Maybe the person is robbing and looting your store because they have no money, and because they're working 2 jobs and they're traveling by bus 2 to 3 hours per day, working 2 jobs, and still can't afford rent. So maybe that's why they robbed and looted the store. Well, if they had cash, if you had some type of cash support for them, maybe they wouldn't be robbing the store. So looking at the symptoms like that and trying to imagine how these people are feeling and what decisions they're making out of those emotions, instead of just blanket casting them as bad people that don't care, that are lazy. Same thing for the rich. I think we do this a lot for the rich, where we look at the rich and we say, oh, these rich people, and we don't see the strife, the struggle that they're going through, and how that contributes to the decisions that they're making. So I hope this conversation with James will shed a little bit of light on that, and at least be a little fun. So I'm going to invite James in right now. My friend James DAngelo, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jim. Good to see you and your hefty beard.
Thank you very much. I've not been cultivating much over the pandemic, but the beard is definitely the garden I've been growing.
Yeah, though you were in Nashville without it. That was the place to have it.
What's up?
You were in Nashville without the beard, but that was the place where you should have had it.
That's true. It's true. I didn't want to look too much like a local.
A lot of beards.
So how you doing, James?
Doing well. Doing well.
Mm-hmm.
Rainy day here in Philadelphia, so good day to do this with you.
How are you feeling about the debate tonight?
Yeah, I haven't even yet decided if I feel like watching it. I'm nervous. I think a lot of people are. So, even like I have a hard time watching sports when it's my favorite team because I get so nervous about it. But I also feel like Biden has more to lose than gain, but he could do well. So, I might just watch it in the highlights where I can digest it without biting my fingernails off.
Yeah, it's definitely the most intense, nerve-wracking debate I've ever thought about. Watching, at least.
Yeah.
I said on the show the other day that I went to pick up my absentee ballot, and or mail-in ballot, or whatever you want to call it, basically remote ballot. And having it in my hand, I was like, wow, this one feels much more important than the ones in the past. It just felt heavy. I don't know. It felt.
Yeah, we're in Michigan, so
yeah.
Your vote's a little more significant than me, who votes in Massachusetts, where I'm almost better off brushing my teeth.
Oh, that's a whole conversation about the Electoral College, huh?
Yeah, but it is what it is. Your vote's very significant. I happen to belong to a tribe that's pretty left, so.
So what's, I'm familiar with a lot of your work with transparency, but I'm sure most people aren't, except the people that you talk to on Twitter. And what got you into this transparency work, and why do you keep working on it?
I think it'd be interesting. Like I noticed that you mentioned in the in your beginning here that you were concerned that these two people, Trump and Biden, weren't able to, or probably won't, sit down and actually try and work on anything together. We pretty much know what it's going to be, right? It's going to be a bunch of jabs at each other and boasts and, very clear and soundbite friendly policy platforms. And it troubled you, and I think it troubles most people that we can't do better. But this is, it was better in the 60s and 70s. We've got the Nixon Kennedy stuff, which was a little better, but it's still pretty jarring to watch two people who are supposed to be diplomats, right? And being very undiplomatic. And I just thought, when you were saying it, I thought of, perhaps the most extreme case of this that I know of was when Kennedy was president and Khrushchev had sent missiles down towards Cuba, so the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy, of course, knew that in front of his people, so if you think of Trump, we know what his people are. If we think of Biden, we know who his people are. Mm-hmm. But Kennedy, in front of his people, which were the Americans, he needed to look very strong and resolute. And because he was a Democrat and had painted himself sort of soft, he was in more trouble than normal. So the American people really wanted to go in and count coup on Russia and Khrushchev. Khrushchev, surprisingly, was under the same pressures back home. He had to look like a strong man. And so the public, you know, if you go back to the Civil War, they were really upset that Robert E. Lee wasn't attacking more. He wasn't aggressive. They were upset at Lincoln for not attacking more, right? The people behind you want real action. But the risk reward for Kennedy and for Khrushchev was nuclear war. And they were terrified. And it's kind of a lesser known story, but Kennedy and Khrushchev set up a back channel so they could communicate secretly between each other. And they opened up this line of communication that was done on Kennedy's end through Bobby. But there was a spy, a known spy in the United States, and the US kind of knew he was a spy, and Russia knew he was a spy, which kind of upsets all our ideas of what spying is about, who would actually go to pool parties with the Kennedys. And he was the back channel connection for Khrushchev. And they were doing these very public statements of, you crossed the line and I'm going to blow you up, right? And then privately they were saying, look, let's not be idiots. And so I think, you know, that's sort of a pretty good introduction to the work, which is once you're standing in public, and Madison spoke about this during talking about how, because they wrote the Constitution in private, right? So they closed the doors, most extreme secrecy ever in the history of any legislature that I know. They wrote the Constitution in Philadelphia, where I'm at right now, just a few blocks away, for 3 months in the summer in Philadelphia, with all the windows shut, sealed with wax and with curtains. Yeah, wow. Maybe fewer flies, but I'll bet you they were sweating their balls off, right? Wow. And in this case, I can say balls because it was all male. But they both spoke about Hamilton and Madison in particular spoke about the importance of closing the doors. And for Madison, it was this sense of partisanship, the hard lining that people do. And, you know, these guys are lifelong legislators. Madison's not super old at the time, but he had been in all types of legislatures before this and been thinking about this forever. And he noted very clearly that when the cameras are on or when the doors are open, nobody asks questions. So you're not going to see Biden ask like a pleasant question to Trump. He's not going to go, oh, that's interesting what you did with the, because Trump's done a couple, I would say, relatively good things. He's worked hard on lowering the incarceration rate. It's just hard to fault that. But you're not going to see Biden go, that's really fantastic. What's behind your rationale? Where are you going with that, right? Madison saw no question asking. And then at the same time, they're writing the French Constitution. And so you've got Robespierre is killing everybody, right? All this, but they write this Constitution, and everything was done in the open. And John Elster, a scholar, went through all 20,000 pages of the published debates and found no examples of anybody asking a question.
Wow.
Right. So there's Madison going, you know, we need to be able to figure this out. I don't want to go in there and have everybody stick to the party line that they had before. So let's shut the doors. Now, Hamilton, and we'll probably talk more about the second aspect where Hamilton was really focused on. For Hamilton, he always found that open proceedings basically provide hooks for the powerful to come in and mess with the proceedings. So for him, it was factions and special interests would come in and destroy the process. And so the Constitution's a fairly short document. I mean, it literally, like, everything's really clean. They did the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments on one page. Everything's super clean, right? Because if you're working in secret and you want people to read something, vote secretly on it, you don't give them 400 pages, right? You give them stuff that's very clean. They got to read it. You're going to support. So that's what we look at. We look at this peculiar dynamic that's happened throughout history that most people aren't aware of because of the excitement over transparency and the excitement over what we think is democracy. We look at this alternative view where the quiet proceedings produce better results.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the analogy of being in a classroom as a kid and the teacher asks a question. Nobody asks questions back to the teacher if they don't understand what's going on because they don't want to look stupid in front of everyone else.
Right.
So you may go up to the teacher afterwards and ask
right. And there's discussion on that, right? How many legislators are going to go, well, what's that word you just used? I didn't understand it. Right?
I don't want to sound stupid. Like I'm well educated. I went to a good school.
Clearly they're going to use some words you aren't familiar with. Everybody doesn't know a few words. If you're in a high level discussion or you don't fully understand the proposal by another legislator. But in public, you have to pretend like you know it because the last thing you're on camera, like, I didn't understand your proposal on NAFTA. What? You don't understand NAFTA?
How stupid are you?
Right. So they're just terrified of opening their mouth. And this isn't because of special interests. Special interests are a real problem, but this is because of the people as well, right? The people we're very unforgiving to changing your mind based on even good new data. Or looking momentarily foolish, but we all are momentarily foolish, and we actually really want our legislators to be ready to ask and inform themselves better of the points of view of the other people. So again, John Elster, 20,000 pages in France, no questions are asked. So and we hear it everywhere that once the doors are shut, even today, what probably a lot of viewers don't know is that the U.S. Congress was mostly secret until 1970. Then we opened almost everything up. But even today, you get a few meetings that are secret, and all the legislators don't like to talk about it because everyone goes, oh, secret, you're corrupt, you're doing a backroom deal. But when you get to speak to them in private, they go, oh, those meetings are a million times better. We all talk to each other. We try and negotiate across there is no partisanship in the closed meetings.
It's something I've noticed in doing this podcast is that when I have a guest on, when we're on the show, our demeanor changes slightly than when we're off the show and still talking. Like right before the show starts and right after the show ends, the dynamics change.
Yeah, certainly. Political.
And that's just I try to take it and bring it down to like, okay, yes, this is happening in Congress, but this is also happening in our own lives. It's the same dynamic at play.
Oh, right. It happens most everywhere, right? And you see it even with couples who are more likely to fight and show their tensions at home. Carrying a very different face in a public atmosphere. We are afraid to like things on Facebook because of our partisanship friends and stuff like that. But even if a good idea comes from across the aisle, right, you don't see any support from my group on Facebook, which are mostly Democrats, though much more Republican recently because trying to break out. But you don't see any support for the things that Trump might do that are okay, right? Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue I want Trump to win, right? I think he's an absolute baboon. But the fact of the matter is he's done a couple good things, but you're not going to see any respect for that, right? You could get kicked out of a dinner party right now for mentioning that.
Oh yeah, you're us with us or against us, and if you mention one thing,
right. So and it's on almost every issue. So if he says X, then the left sort of feels compelled to take Y. Because of this terror to acknowledge. But, inside, I think a lot of people are doing that. And when I have, as we say, private conversations, it's so much easier. But if I'm in a public forum, then I'll be under attack for mentioning that maybe somebody did something okay once or twice.
And that's us as kind of private citizens. I mean, slightly more public in some ways, but when you're talking about publicly elected officials at the level of the U.S. Congress, Hey, that's
Yeah.
millions of people
Yeah.
from
So,
not just within the U.S. but around the world.
yeah. So the debate tonight is, obviously it's not a debate. I mean, what we're getting is a show. It's a bit like boxing where
Mm.
you have huge incentives to knock the other person out, not get the most out of them so we can build a better society. The goal is to knock them out on all points. If you acknowledge one point, then you look weak.
So one question I want to ask you is, I know that at some point voting for citizens was more open, right? And then it shifted to being more confidential. Do
Yeah.
you know anything about why it shifted or what was going on?
Yeah, it was big. So today we're seeing this massive rise in partisanship, campaign finance, inequality, chaos, lack of respect for the government. There's only one other point in American history where it parallels this, and this is the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, we had a similar rise, campaign finance, chaos, mistrust in government. If you see the Scorsese film Gangs of New York, he focuses on this time period, and you're literally talking violence in the streets and hardcore partisanship. Edgar Allan Poe was killed in an election event. Right? Most people don't know. It was a couping event. And all of a sudden, it ended. So if you look up the Gilded Age, right, the robber barons are controlling everything. They're owning everything. They're cornering gold and railroads, and just literally everything is being controlled. Tammany Hall is the famous name, right? They're controlling the presidential election from New York, etc. And then it ends. And if you look up the Gilded Age, go look up right now on Wikipedia, it'll just be like this terrible time when all the rich are, and there's not a section going, and then it ended because. Nothing, right? When you think about the Gilded Age, there's not a section that says it ended because. But then you look up the next era, which is called the Progressive Era, and it begins that year. So the year the Gilded Age ends, when we're at the massive, wildest, most crazy time, then all of a sudden it's the Progressive Era, and birds are singing in the trees, right? and you go to an election event, and people are peaceful and they're chatting and everything's cool. And people commented on this. They're like, wow, they've even stopped parades on election days. People used to give out beer and there'd be brawling and blood and death, as I said, Edgar Allan Poe. Left and right. A newspaper from Cincinnati in 1888 said only 8 people killed on election day. This was because up until 1890, all the votes were public for citizens. And in 1890, we start introducing the secret ballot. And within a couple of years, secret ballot all over the US. And it takes a while to perfect. So they roll it out and they have to learn some things. But it was the moment of greatest transparency in history compared to today. So back then in 1890, Congress was actually voting secretly, but all the people were voting openly. So you would have people lining up and going, hey, I'll give you a shot for your vote. And you give them a shot, you'd watch them vote. So they give out tons of shots, so they give out chicken legs. But keep in mind, they're also counting the vote tallies. So you go, oh, the Republican mayor's now 5,000 votes ahead. All of a sudden, those 5,000 votes sitting in the street are worth more. So you might not just give them a shot, you might give them a shot and a chicken leg. Well, now it's close, and now you're about 1,000 votes away, but you've only got 1,000 people in the street. You're ready to pay them real money. And in 1890, not adjusted dollars, a random person on the street, if they waited long enough, could make between $25 and $200 for their vote.
Non-adjusted dollars.
Non-adjusted dollars.
Oh, that's a lot of money now.
It makes a lot of sense, right? If you're neck and neck, you got to get those last votes out. And we see that in Congress today, right? Where's all the action at? Everything's close, right? It's always 50-50, and then McCain comes in at the last minute, Obamacare drops his thumb down. But how much can McCain demand from everybody else for that vote? It's a lot, right? So he's going to get legislation pushed through. He's going to get concessions from whatever side and they put it out there, right? So when you vote in Congress right now, your vote will be green, red, or yellow. And most people go, okay, green and red. Well, that makes sense. No, or yes or yellow, undecided.
Mm.
And who gets all the attention? The undecideds, right? They're like, just waiting to see if anyone here can convince me from either side. And oh, by the way, I want this bridge put up in New Jersey, and I would like the road put in, and I don't like what we're doing with the trade, and I would like the dock coming in. Just talk to me. And you get that. So, and that's the trouble with open voting, right? The last votes of the undecided become super valuable. So the people who care the least get the most in return.
Or the people who pretend to care the least get the most.
Right. And it's obviously what open voting does, and it's basically the point that you made, is it takes government, which is the opposite of a market, right? So you have markets, free markets, money, change, everything's exchanged. Government exists because markets have so many known imperfections, right? So there's economies of scale. There's all these kinds of imperfections. And so governments exist because without them, you get kings, right? And kings tell you exactly what to do. And if there's a bigger king over there, you better try and kill them or he's going to take you over. So you get empires, right? And that's how empires work. Well, governments came in and they actually softened the blow of most of these known market problems because they're non-market based. But as soon as you open the vote, then the vote itself becomes the economy. And that can be bought, sold, or traded. And you're returning market imperfections back into government. And we've seen it every time in history where you have open voting, you have a market, and then the people with the most power, oftentimes the most money, but not always, dominate the market.
And you've studied this across not just the U.S., but other countries, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we see it. You and I met recently in Uganda. It's a big deal there, right? I would say it's a bigger deal in these developing countries because who's the most powerful player in all these countries? It's the president. President watches legislator votes. And if someone even peeps that they might vote against him, he could be arrested for sure. Trumped up charges are trivial for these presidents down there. He could also get shot. And there's tons of records of this. But Museveni, who wanted to change the Constitution a couple years before we were there, I was there for this. And in fact, I was very excited to be there for this. It's called Toji Kwatiko if you're Ugandan, which means don't touch that, which means don't touch the Constitution. The president Museveni was a Democratic hero in '86 when he took over. He had laid out this beautiful Constitution. So everybody from around the world is like, this guy's the guy. But the longer he goes in, the more people that want him dead, the more likely, people are going to try and stick him in jail if he gets out of office, all this. Now he's fearing for his life. So he's 80-ish. I forget what the Constitution is, but he had put in a Constitution that says, at 80, that's it. You can't be president anymore. So he puts it out there. I'd like to change the Constitution. Well, all of Museveni's detractors, which is almost everybody in the country, said, sure, you can go about trying to change the Constitution the constitutional way, which is by secret ballot. So vote in the legislature. And so the big fight over that was whether the vote would be open or closed. Museveni comes back, he goes, no problem. As you know, to get the secret vote, 3 members of parliament have to raise their hand and ask for the secret vote.
An open vote to get a secret vote, huh?
So you're raising your hand is like it's like you're behind that wall, right? If you raise it even up, you're going to lose your fingers, right? The bullets will come flying. So no, he wasn't. The opposition wasn't able to get the vote to be secret, and so Museveni sat in parliament during that vote and won 95-2 or something ridiculous. And so this is the original reason we had our first secret committees ever. Stuart England, 1666. King Charles was terrifying the members of the House of Commons. You're going to vote against me? I just asked for I forget the amount, $1 million more to go and buy 10 more horses and, have this harem in the back, right? He would ask for absurd things like that. And the parliament would be like, what? No, right? He's like, okay, vote on it. And he'd watch them vote. And if you voted against it, you were in shackles and dragged out. He chased people through the countryside over their votes. House of Commons is like, this is a transparency issue. And so they developed, for the first time in world history, they knew that committees could meet in secret, but not the full parliament. And so they developed this thing called the Committee of the Whole. Still exists in the United States today, exists in almost all modern democracies. A thing called the Committee of the Whole, which makes sense. It's a committee of all the members. And they would get together, and that had the ability to reject things but not to pass them. And his funding went into the Committee of the Whole, and it got pooped on. and he got no funding. He was furious. Well, then Congress is like, man, the secret shit's working pretty good. 2 years later, he's brought in on charges. He's indicted. He's tried. He's found guilty. And he's hung. That's separation of power. And you telling me that the framers of our Constitution didn't know all about this? They knew everything about that. So all the little legislatures across the colonies had committees of the whole, secret committees of the whole.
Wow. And it still exists today, committees of the whole?
Yeah, the Committee of the Whole was a huge deal up until 1970, but one of the main targets of the 1970 Legislative Reorganization Act was the Committee of the Whole. The Committee of the Whole was secret from 1789 till 1971, January 3rd, when the votes started to be published. And the correlations are just as insane as you get. Inequality was at an all-time low, shot up like a rocket ship. Campaign finance, all-time low, because who's going to pay for a vote they can't see? Nobody ever in history pays for votes they can't see. Now you can see all the members' votes, so campaign finance shoots up, right? Everything. Partisanship, as we spoke about, because now your decisions are on record, so you have to hardline with the wall. Partisanship shoots up. So everything we know about, right? We were 1960s. It's so crazy to think about how crappy that legislature was. Our members of Congress in the 1960s couldn't be demographically worse. They were almost all racist. They were all male. They were wealthy, mostly Southern. And they just passed the civil rights legislation. They just passed environmental legislation. They were killing the rich with heavy taxes. They were just like, give me a break. Wilbur Mills, Southern guy, head of the Ways and Means. He's like, hell yeah, rich people, that's great. That's all awesome. I just love the rich, And then he'd close the door to his committee and just go, because, that's how we are in Boston, right? Everyone's like, oh, we're so super liberal in Massachusetts, right? We're not the most liberal. Like, we don't really care about the poor, but we hate the motherfucking rich. And so you let's close the door. We love going to their parties, right? We're not communists. Like, hey, I can go to a rich person's party. I can dance and enjoy myself. But as soon as that curtain's closed, we're like, yeah, they should pay more. And so taxes on the wealthy in before Ways and Means Committee was open were 74% on the marginal rate on the top 1%. Now they're 30s. And enforcement, so that's a big deal, right? Trump's tax stuff just came out. There's no enforcement, because when you go after taxation, you don't always have to go after the statutory rate. You can go after enforcement. Congress is the one that budgets the IRS. That budget's tanking, right? So they don't have the lawyers, they don't have the people, they don't have the manpower to go after the wealthy who have all the massive accountants and all the lawyers. Well, if you've only got $1 million of budget, you've only got $1 million worth of lawyers. And if all the wealthy people are going to sue you and come after you and all this, you're going to run. And so people like Trump get away with this. Now, Trump's going to be in a bit of trouble, because they're going to take most of that budget now and dig through this with a fine-tooth comb if they haven't been already. Not clear that he's broken any major laws, so some of it looks shady. But if you want the wealthy to pay more, you don't just raise the statutory rate. You have to raise enforcement, and you have to be careful, because you can insert things that affect the tax code in almost every piece of legislation. So between the two big tax reforms that we've had, 1986 and 2017, there have been 20,000 changes in the tax code.
Wow.
Yeah.
Which means only the rich people are able to dance around the tax code.
Right. And we know how many there would be.
Lawyers.
Yeah, we know how many there would be if those committees were secret. Nothing. So the tax code, via the massive increase in complexity, the tax code, and before we opened the doors, was pretty darn thin. It ain't thin no more.
You made me think about something. I think a lot of times we assume that the people in government are the richest people, but they're not. They have money, but they're not.
People in government are the richest people?
Well, like people, elected officials, they're so rich, they're exploiting the system, this and that, at least in the US.
No, the numbers
They have that much money compared to the really rich people.
I'll give you the numbers, though. The interesting thing is the median legislator only recently passed $1 million in net worth. Now, that used to make people really terrified in the 70s because $1 million meant a lot. You've got $1 million net worth right now. It means you might not even own your own home, because most homes in almost all cities, certainly DC, are worth a couple million. And if you have a couple kids and are going to school and all of that, so you're probably paying rent and you're very nervous about the future. So $1 million median for our legislators is only recent. It's just a few years ago that it switched. You do have some members, Dan Issel, who, by the way, is the head of the Transparency Caucus, or was before he retired, which is very fitting, right? All billionaires support all the transparency groups. So the richest people are always involved in pro-transparency because they know who it helps. The other thing that drives people crazy is they go, well, when they entered office, they had, $4,000 net worth, and then, wow, now they've got $8 million. And I'm like, but that person inherited a home from his dad. Is that bribery? Is that what did it, So that happened to me, right? 10 years ago, my net worth was next to nothing. And my parents passed away, and brownstone in Boston divided by me and my brothers. Now I have a net worth that might terrify somebody who's looking at my changes based on what my income should be. So people love to go, oh, they got richer, so it's corruption. A lot of members of Congress, and I don't mean to defend all of them, because there is some of them that are playing games in the stock market and all that, but a lot of members of Congress are very successful people before they enter office. They start stock portfolios, real estate businesses, a number of things, right? Not all of them leave them. Trump didn't leave many of his businesses when he, and some of those businesses do fabulously well. And so they do a lot better. There is some insider trading, but my master's degree is in electrical engineering, and you realize that any system you build, whether you want to send electricity from your outlet to your toaster, you're going to lose something. There's going to be some corruption, right? You're going to lose power just in your wire. Put gasoline in that engine. You're lucky to get 25% of that energy out of it. There's going to be some corruption. People go crazy when they see legislators involved in some corruption, which is, I would say, mostly small-time stuff. So every year, 4 legislators are convicted in the United States for bribery or corruption-based events. But that's 4 out of 8,000.
Across all the levels, you're talking.
Federal and state. So I'm leaving out.
Federal and state, okay.
4 out of 8,000. So we're talking 0.1% less. So 0.05%, which makes them maybe cleaner than most people on Earth. But if we take that one example, it's just like when you see footage of a hurricane, they're not going to show you the footage of everything going well. They're going to show you the one house that lost its roof, right? So everyone goes, oh, the houses they've lost their roof. Meanwhile, you're in the town where the hurricane is, and you're like playing Frisbee with your neighbors, right? And the Frisbee's going a little funny, but that's about it. So people love those extraordinary examples, and then they've turned it all around and made it look like Congress are the biggest corrupt people on Earth. Yes, some corruption. Sometimes a member of Congress will take one of those government stamps, lick it, and put it on a Christmas letter for his mother. And let me tell you, the public goes crazy. They really do. I'm like, okay, so Bezos is killing it. He's making $1 billion a day. He's lobbying Congress on everything, from roads to fucking electricity to whatever you want, right? He lobbies everything. He's killing it, and everybody's worried about that stamp. And you don't have to work too hard. Type in stamps, and you'll find members of Congress who've abused that, and everyone went crazy. Meanwhile,
seriously,
going crazy They're just killing it. And we're talking really oil companies who are getting subsidies. We're talking big pharma, right? These people are almost untouchable. And the public's like, Congress is corrupt. And I'm like, no. They're like, but that guy. I'm like, but statistically, they're not corrupt. It's sort of like saying all Twitter users are rapists. I'm sure a couple Twitter users have raped somebody. But we don't jump to that conclusion. All people from Iowa are rapists. No, yes, rape happens in Iowa and murder happens in Michigan, but we don't say Michiganders are murderers. But we make that mistake with Congress. And why is it? I know I'm talking because I just had a bunch of coffee. So
it's fine.
This really benefits the real corruption. So the Bezos of the world, the oil companies, all of this, they're just like, killer, keep pointing at Congress. And they fund the groups that keep pointing it at Congress. They fund Common Cause. They fund all these groups who make money only when government looks bad. And so their entire goal is to just attack government. Government's transparent, so you can see all this shit too. People are like, oh, they're so close. I'm like, they're the most open institution on earth, the US Congress. I don't know of another institution even remotely as open. Apple, give me a break. I mean, they don't publish anything. Google, all these big companies are not open at all. Amazon's, they're all famously closed. The U.S. Congress is the most open institution. They're much more open than any House gathering. They're much more open than any PTA meeting. They are open.
Well, why did those reforms go through in the 60s and or 70s? And more importantly, who was pushing them? Was there a group that was really pushing for it? Like, what led up to it?
I'll tell you who wasn't pushing them, because it's a good question. We really don't know exactly all the details. There aren't clear, and that some of it's not clear intentionally, I suspect. But there's one thing we do know. There wasn't one citizen, not one, marching around Congress with a sign saying, open it up. Not one. There wasn't one special interest group formed of citizens going, open it up. After Watergate, Common Cause formed. That's 74. These reforms were passed October 26, 1970, signed by President Nixon. President Nixon, of course, had something to gain. But we know that lobbyists were aware that this would provide some benefits. We've seen that. We know that members of Congress were speaking about it. So they would say, you want a lobbyist on your elbow while you're writing legislation, you pass these reforms. But no one mentioned the Constitution, which, by the way, Article 1, Section 5 provides a right to constitutional secrecy. A right. No one mentions it. There's thousands of pages of public debate on this. And members of Congress are terrified of the people who all think, oh, we're smart. We're going to follow the constitutional process. We follow our legislators. You know, to anybody out there who's listening right now, I don't care if you're a genius with an IQ of 200, you don't follow your legislator who votes almost 1,000 times a year on about 1 million pages of documents and legislation. And if you follow 0.1%, you get the big thumbs up. You would be rare. People who teach Congress do not follow legislation, and they are more ready to tell you that because they actually understand how big a beast it is. So we don't know who did it. I could go into this really long sort of conspiracy story if you want about the economics developed around it, the publishing that was made by a millionaire-funded group to create this argument for opening. And there's a thing called the Public Choice Journal, where public choice basically means vote trading. It launched in 1966, the same year as the first Republican book that suggested opening the Congress was published. And so by 1970, these things were opened up. But both Democrats and both right and left, there were pressures, but usually from more of a organized interest perspective to open them up.
So one thing that just popped into my mind was you saying that they were attacking, these groups benefit when Congress looks bad, right?
Oh yeah, Common Cause. I mean, that's not even my own critique. I actually lost my breath when I saw that written the first time, right? So Watergate, they were very prosperous. People were donating a lot of money, but then Watergate sort of trailed off. They still had their offices, and they were sending their kids to school. And if you're living in DC, it's usually private school because the system's so bad. And they're like, whoa, we're all going to be without a job. So it's really, we only make money when government looks bad. So you have very big left groups with lots of funding who don't go, oh, those corporations are the ones screwing everything up. They'll get no funding for that.
Yeah, because corporations are the ones who do the funding. I'm not going to pay you money to say
now they're much more institutional than before. They get more institutional funding than before. Very little citizens are pouring money into this, but they were doing very well only well when government looks bad. So you see the ratings drop of Congress, right? And it drops like a stone, like around 5%. But it's a really unfair thing because you've got organized groups who make their money only when government looks bad. So it's this massive push. Again, it's like, I lick that stamp, I put it on a letter. If Common Cause sees it, whoa, we found a big one, put that everywhere, put that all in the news. This guy's using stamps, right? And it's like, but there's Jeff Bezos in the other room sitting in the committee, and he's killing it. There's the NRA, there's the wealthy are killing it on taxation. Oh, no, the member of Congress, get him out.
Well,
right?
It reminds me of what I was talking about in the beginning. It's just this idea of trying to make everyone look distrustful. These people are against you. They don't care about you. They're screwing you over. It's not that they're using the stamp. It's that what else are they doing? What else are they hiding? How much are they? They are ruining your life. It's like, whoa. Where did that come from? How did you make that leap from stamp to this person is the devil?
And you and I have gone back and forth on this. You even sent me a great clip on it. And so I'll introduce the concept here. But, it's like, every morning, the first thing I do, I wake up, I get on Twitter, I've got a little hot button, it clicks and it finds all the people in the past day who wrote, Congress is run by bribery, or Congress is run by legalized bribery, or, they're all accepting money. And there's always a good handful of tweets on that. Because that's what everyone believes, right? It's all, they pocketed the money and they're like, screw everybody, right? First of all, it's important to look at some of the numbers, right? So the NRA does give money to candidates, but the most they give is $10,000. It usually breaks down to $3,000 and $2,000. The NRA doesn't have a ton of funding. There is no record in history of someone who was against the NRA recording them trying to offer them a bribe. So I want you to picture the scenario, right? Hey, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we know you're against gun control. We'd like to offer you $2,000, not for your pocket that you can't put in your pocket, but for your campaign. We'd like you to change your votes on gun control. Try and make that offer to a homeless person. And the homeless person will be like, no, keep your money, you jerk. Right? Yeah. These people are getting so members of Congress make $174,000. And everyone's going around going, wow, if I offer them a postage stamp, they're going to vote for me, right? That's not how it works. There's no record. Think of all the money. You could be the next presidential candidate if you record the NRA making that offer. They don't make those offers. So this notion of bribery, first of all, is overrated. But if we actually follow the spending of the NRA or pro-Israel groups or big pharma or big oil and the Koch money, if we just follow the money, and it's pretty easy to follow now, we see it's not spent going towards changing someone's mind or getting them to change their vote. It's always spent against the person they want to change. So if Jim Kleiber decides that he doesn't like what the NRA is doing, the NRA is going to take all their money and give it to his challenger. But more importantly, and this is where they really spend their money, is they're going to run attack ads on you. They're going to run attack ads, play a little bit fair and square and inform the public and talk about the gun control issue. No, they're going to run attack ads on whatever hurts you. So if they found some photo, even if someone photoshopped it, and they didn't, if they found it on Twitter of you like molesting a puppy, that's what everyone's going to see. Right, so they were on an attack ad on you. And this terrorizes legislators because attack ads really do change polling numbers. And every special interest with a few $100,000 in their coffers can run these attack ads, and they're very powerful. And so we've seen, as soon as you open Congress up, we see this massive, massive rise in attack ads, massive rise in challenger funding. And a lot of times we know, so people are like, well, this guy didn't even have a challenger. I'm like, well, they had a good idea at a challenger, and you can tell because of when they funded him. They funded him the day the election cycle starts, right? So that's to intimidate possible. They're coming in because they like someone, right? And we know this, right? This is the way humans work. We suspect that 95% of more of all campaign finance is more of a panic button and negative button.
Mm.
So why is Biden raising so much money? Because he's a great candidate? No, he kind of sucks, right? His views on crime aren't that great. He's kind of corporate, right? If you're left, you're just not super excited about Biden. Why is he raising so much freaking money? Because he sells his votes? No, he's raising money because everybody hates Trump, right? Why is Trump raising money? Not because, honestly, anybody on the right likes him. They probably don't unless you're a real fascist. But he's good for the economy, and they're terrified of Biden.
No, they're terrified of the people they think are behind Biden pulling the strings. They're terrified of
whatever it is, but they know
terrified of what he represents.
Be greater taxation and this and that. So it's really easy on their sheets. They go, okay, if I invest $100,000, Biden loses. We maintain these $1 million of loopholes, right? And so they're gambling. They've been doing this calculation. They play the odds. So we call this not bribery, we call it broobery, because all the money in campaign finance is directed away from your targeted person. So if I run a negative ad against you, I'm not putting money into a single politician's pocket. I'm giving it to Facebook, or I'm giving it to the TV station or a radio station, right? Bribery is I give you money, you change your vote. Mm-hmm. This is I give everybody else money to make you change your vote. And the oil companies do this very aggressively. So if you start stepping out against oil, especially, and Democrats don't really get this because most of the money doesn't come in against Democrats. Almost all the money is targeted at moderate Republicans. And how is it targeted? It's through primary challenges. So a moderate Republican comes out and it's like, wow, that climate is kind of a problem. Look up Bob Inglis, right? There's many. The head count is big here. As soon as they hear that, they go, boom, next thing you know, there's this well-funded primary challenger. Dark money pouring into ads left and right. Coke funded usually, but Standard Oil, Exxon, all these guys will fund these guys. And this is where they work. They work on the margins, the moderates. All of a sudden, you get this massive primary challenger. Nobody really votes in the primaries, so the ads really do affect. They're much cheaper to run in the primaries. And they'll knock you out. And Bob Inglis was a presidential hopeful who got taken out by the right in the primary. And we see this time and time and time again. And so that's why if you're a moderate right, you have to pretend you're not.
And it's not that you have to pretend you're not. You have to not be, because you can't pretend and then vote differently in secrecy. You have to go with it, right? Yeah,
there are moments you can eke your little things, right? You can do your little stuff, but you're left very, very little, right? So Elizabeth Warren a couple months ago proposed to a Republican-led committee to take down the statues, these Confederate statues. Well, of course, if that was done in public, all of these Republicans would have been excoriated, right? They'd have been hung from those statues.
Yeah.
But they managed to close the doors on that committee. It's July. And they voted to take them down. Elizabeth Warren proposed it. Usually that's like, everyone knows if she proposes, all the right's going to go against it, unless it's closed. They're going to be like, well, it's better for our country if, we're not sitting on this racist sore thumb, right? We want to be leading the world in terms of beauty. And so they passed an Elizabeth Warren bill in closed doors 3 months ago. So they wait for these opportunities. So if you're moderate, there's going to be a couple places you're going to sink your teeth in. And we're familiar with this from game theory, right? Everyone's like, oh, you should just have the balls and vote the way you want, right? And it's like, okay, so I'm going to vote on something that won't pass. And if I vote on it, I'll be taken out by my primary challenger or someone who's spiritually entirely opposed to what I am.
Mm.
So everything's got a risk reward. I'm going to vote for it. It's not going to pass. So better not to vote for it and stay in office and keep waiting for those little opportunities. And every legislator, every single one, plays this game. When the vote is secret, you vote things the way you want every time, the way they should be every time, the way you think is better for the country every time. And do we see it in the data? Yeah, we see it in the data every single time. You want to see an angry person? Ask any of these pro-transparency groups for evidence of the counterexample. We've been doing this for 6 years. I spoke about this in the Capitol, and a pro-transparency advocate ripped the mic from my hand while I was asking for evidence. When I sent him an email later, he said he would send the police after me. And I said, okay, right? We've been asking for evidence, counterexamples for 6 years, and we found nothing. I suspect they're going to exist. I don't think that every time it's going to happen. I suspect they really do exist, but they're going to be small, and you know, we're going to see the data. I mean, it's just so crazy. You see inequality, woo, open doors. You see inequality, close doors, woo, you know.
So a question I've been thinking about is, what secrecy would you think the Congress should have? Or do you want Congress to have? Is it secrecy on every vote? Like,
excellent question. So people go, "Oh, James, you're a pro-transparency advocate. I'm a pro-secrecy advocate. You want everything to be secret." I'm like, no, we're not. We actually only suggest secrecy in one place, which is committee votes. People, you know, members of Congress do final votes. So throughout history, if you watch the Lincoln movie, the whole movie's about a vote. It's a really beautiful movie. And it's about a vote. It's about a public vote on the final vote. So Congress hasn't been voting just secretly throughout history. It goes through committees, all secret, all secret, all secret. And then they have this last sort of celebrated. They all put feathers in their cap. They dress up. They take a shower. And they go do the final vote, which everybody watches. Every year, literally every year since 1789 until 1970, there are around 200 final votes. And if you watch the Lincoln movie, you can be forgiven for not knowing there were 5 other final votes that day, right? It makes it look like that's all anybody's thinking about is that vote to free the slaves. But there were 5 other votes that day. They were all public and they're all on record, and we can see exactly who. We do not, even though if you watch that movie, you'll see how much freaking corruption happens on an open vote, because it's all about the corrupting of the votes. And shown from the Lincoln side, but just as much was happening on the other side. And if we look at the Medicaid Part D, I believe it's 2003, November 22nd, it's trivial to see the corruption. They're on the cameras. You have legislators crying as people are threatening them. Barney Frank yelling into the cameras, "Stop the arm twisting." This is on camera, but that's a final vote. And because the people want some transparency, and they do follow some votes, usually about 4 a year, we'll give them 200.
Final votes.
And then we would roll back the Legislative Reorganization Act, which did not change the final vote access. It changed just the committee votes, markup sessions, right? So where you're proposing and doing stuff. And this turns out to be a lot of votes. So we're talking, you know, about 1,000 votes a year that we're going to lock back into secrecy. But don't forget, people are like, well, how am I going to vote for my member? Well, you don't follow the 200 already. So please don't tell me you're following the committee ones, because we've seen all the evidence on it. People never follow that. John F. Kennedy was a senator, 1955, something like that. Every single one of his committee votes were secret. And we still elected him because he had done all the public voting on the floor votes. He had done his speeches. He went and did all his things before that. So we elect people mostly because they're kind of cute, but also we kind of like their policies. Yeah, I guarantee you Trump would not be so famous if he was, you know, if he had a different sort of charisma, right? But there is someone who said that the funniest person in the general election always wins. And I've gone back in my mind, I'm like, it's pretty true.
The one who has the most like sense of humor.
Right. So I went back through all that. I was like, oh yeah, Clinton was way funnier than Bush, but Bush was funnier than Dukakis, but Reagan was way funnier than Carter, but Carter was way funnier than Ford, right? And it's just so crazy that it's just like it's so charisma matters, right? And that's how we were electing people before. And it turns out if you basically took, and studies have shown this pretty good, if you take 500 people at random and stuff them in a room, they're going to create pretty good legislation because their interests in the people are about the same.
Well, I imagine there are many viewers out there who are like me who didn't really even know there are committee votes. I mean, it's stupid to say, but like,
exactly. Well, I want transparency.
We want to see, like, we want the transparency of the McCain, like, doing the thumb down, which is the public vote, which you're saying has been public.
Yeah,
right? Has been.
My favorite moment, one of my favorite moments, I'm in Boston. My work had just gone out there. My video's like close to 100,000 views. I'm getting support from people at Harvard. And these three guys from represent.us show up and they're livid. They're just like, you're the guy. You're the guy. You are anti-transparency. And I'm just like, well, let's chat, right? And they're kind of young, so I'll forgive them for being completely stupid. But they're like, how can you take away all the votes? I'm like, we're not. We're leaving the floor votes open. And they're like, and I was like, do you know how many times? Wait, no. I said, oh, you guys, you follow votes, right? Oh yeah. Really important, follow votes, right? And I was like, so tell me, how many times a year does your federal legislator vote? And they, it's like Larry, Dick, and Moe. They're like, and they go, 12. One of them says 12. And as soon as he says 12, the other goes, no, it's not 12, right? And I'm like, yeah, it's a little higher. And they form a little caucus again, going back and forth. They go, 60? A little bit higher, right? They're like, well, higher than that. I was like, but you told me you follow votes. And these are the people involved in this process of making it more transparent, right? These are they're energetic citizens who care, right? These are people with a good heart. They want the system to be better, completely unwilling to admit that they really don't read legislation or follow votes because the amount of times I was like, no, it's more like 1,000. And they all turn pale, knowing that even if they spent their entire life, they might not be able to understand or follow those votes. And that's just the way it is.
So I'm imagining in my mind, they vote on committee. Do the things that they vote on committee always go to the whole floor, or is there some things that just end on the vote?
Right. They're filters, right? So if it fails committee, it doesn't make it to the floor. So there's a great power of rejection. And for you on the Republican side, this is huge because it means that closed committees tend to repeal funding more often than open ones. Right, so it's just easier to reject that special interest request for more money. So earmarks, all that stuff dissipates very easily in committees. And so you see that, we had closed doors in the 60s. Spending was really tight. The debt was really low. And yet we were still providing pretty darn good services. And inequality was low. We were taxing the wealthy pretty heavily. The wealthy weren't complaining, and they were still wealthy. So what's great is it really provides things for both sides, right? The Republicans want smaller government with less spending. Check. The people on the left want more services and low inequality. Check. How is that possible? Because it's less corruption. We're not giving crap away to Trump, right? We're going after people. And again, we talk about, going after people for the amount they pay. If Trump pays $750, which is easily 20 times less than what I paid last year, and I'm not a millionaire, it's just absurd. It's really absurd. I mean, that's what he's paid, around 2,000 in the last 15 or whatever the numbers are. It's just ridiculous. So
I asked that because if it is like kind of an early stage vote or more of like a deliberative vote before it goes to the final vote, I think maybe even using some of that language, like talking about different types of votes, that would be more secret instead of votes, because I think some people hear votes and they go, oh my God, they're going to close the whole thing down. I don't trust these people. Why? But for me, yeah, I wish Congress had more deliberation. And it's very hard to deliberate when people are looking over your shoulder all the time, especially people who have a lot of money.
People don't deliberate in public. That's what we're saying. It's not even very hard. We just don't see it. And this is a fun story. There's a guy named George Mitchell who was concerned, people are concerned about the environment. George Mitchell's the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat side, through the 80s. Very concerned. He's a moderate Dem. Very concerned about climate, and he's very concerned about acid rain. And he can't get anyone to agree on anything in the public sessions. So you have the hardcore Greenpeace type climate people who won't accept a single provision from the business side. And then he's got the people on the Republican side who they won't accept a single softening on the other side. And he's like, I've been doing this for 10 years. I've been holding these meetings for 10 years to pass the Clean Air Act amendments, which when they passed in 1990, by the way, are easily the most powerful environmental legislation any country has ever produced. It's the only piece of environmental legislation you can see with every satellite that goes up. Right? The air is cleaner. Affected waterways, affected everything, but it really changed things. But he's like, I'm getting killed by the left. It's on the left. He wants this changed. He wants legislation. But if everybody's going for everything, which is what you see in the debate tonight, you're going to end up with nothing. And so he shut the door. He did more than shut the doors. He took all the big players and stuffed them into his office. He's got this kind of cherry office right underneath the dome. And he shut the doors and stuck guards outside of it. And other members of Congress are complaining they couldn't get in. And he's just like, a few weeks later, they sign and pass by a landslide the biggest environmental bill in history. And they, of course, named it in a way so that no one really thought it was big. The 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. They made it, they could have named it anything they wanted. But they're like, how boring can we make this? Because the public goes crazy too. And guess what? What happened to Mitchell after he passed the best environmental legislation in history? He got excoriated by the left for doing it behind closed doors. And so if you read his biography on it, he doesn't even talk about the closed door sessions.
Wow.
Which is a tragedy because that's the real gift here. And what's crazy is he gets picked, and you look like you might have some Irish in you, do you?
Not that I know of. Me. The beard looks a little red.
By Clinton in '94 to head over to deal with Ireland. And he runs into the same problems. They're having these public meetings. The people, I forget the names of the factions, right? But it's like, I don't know, Protestant, whatever. The IRA and all that, right? They get in there and those guys go, I'm going to slit your fucking neck and kill all your children. I'm going to eat you alive, right? That's what they're doing on camera, right? And he's like, exactly
that.
I'm not even playing, right?
Yeah. No, I know.
And he's terrified to do the closed door thing again. So he tries to battle this out for a couple of years, and he's doing private meetings with each individual group, but he's never suggested to do it behind closed doors. Finally, him and I forget the name of the British guy who writes more openly about this because he wasn't excoriated for it. They got all the big players into some private sessions in England. And a week later, they signed the deal. That's held peace, not the best peace in the world, but they've held peace since. Again, the secret was the closed doors. And if you're in Ireland, everybody knows his name. Everybody knows George Mitchell's name. Americans don't know who they are, especially the left, who should be lauding him for insane gifts. They don't know who he is. He's still alive. He works in D.C. He's getting older.
Yeah, because the extremes put pressure to conform.
He compromised with big business. He let some coal workers keep their jobs. They funded some of those coal workers. Oh my God, he licked a stamp and sent it to his mom. It's just like, give me a break. While Common Cause is probably going, closed doors, you crazy lunatics. send us more money.
And then people out in LA are like, "Oh my God, the smog's gone. This is amazing."
Well, LA's still got a problem, but it's huge change. Chattanooga, the particles per million were like 2 million, right? It's like, you couldn't even walk. It was like one big piece of carbon dioxide in front of you, but it's gone, right? The changes are enormous, and we could do that again, right? There's people are like, those Republican idiots, so the Democrats are still the problem here, right? Republicans are a problem.
I say the extreme side.
Why do Democrats have a problem? First of all, they think every Republican's an idiot and doesn't care about climate change. I'm from the South. I'm a Southern boy. I speak Southern. I talk to some of these legislators. As soon as they close the door, they go, oh, what are you, crazy? I get climate change. I mean, come on. I know how all the insurance rate worry. Everybody's like worried about climate change. But if I make a move on this publicly, I'm done. And they're going to replace me with someone who's 10 times more psychotic than me. And the left is just going, that idiot, he doesn't understand it. I'm like, what if you protected him? What if you gave him shelter from the special interest groups, the oil companies, who are much more likely to terrorize him than you are by shouting on Twitter? And so the left has a real problem by thinking that the right are a bunch of fools, right? And this is on many issues. And we see it all the time. You close the doors, and on most legislation, it takes a hard left turn. People do want the better society. They do want more of a collective. You just got to watch out for those Tea Party lunatics.
And again, close the doors in the committee sessions.
Right. That's where it matters, right? So say, for example, say you want to take out the NRA. You're just sick of the NRA. And believe me, the left pretends to be sick of the NRA. The right hate the NRA, right? Because who's going to get terrorized by the NRA?
The elected officials, the congressman, you're saying.
The moderates on the right. So keep in mind, after Sandy Hook, 90% of all Americans wanted tougher gun laws. 80% with those with family members in the NRA. All the senators knew this. And yet they didn't move. Why? Because it's their ass on the line, and their ass meaning they can't do anything for the future of the country if they move on the gun laws, right? And it's not clear that even if they would have voted that time, it would have passed. So they were in a terrible situation. And so they voted party line, right? They would not have at all. They would have loved to have stuck it so hard to the NRA, right? They hate the NRA. And that's what the people on the left like, NRA is the problem. I'm like, but you don't lose sleep at night by these guys. Moderate Republicans are terrorized by them, right? And if you give them protection, and we see it every time, they screw it to the NRA. What was the NRA doing before they opened the doors? I'll tell you what they were doing. They were at 4-H clubs teaching young kids how to shoot cork guns.
Really?
Really. Membership. So, yeah, you have to be very terrified of these powerful factions, right? And these powerful factions are what tormented Hamilton. They were tormented Madison, which is why they moved to secrecy. And when they moved to secrecy, they got a lot of compromise. People are all like, oh, well, they were terrible in the Constitution. They blacks were 3/4 and all that. I'm like, it's actually kind of jaw-dropping how much they got, right? 3/4 is actually quite phenomenal, right? If you think about it. It's horrifying to think about now. And it seems like the most racist thing in the world. But those were all racists. And they didn't put slavery as a mandate in the Constitution. If that had been public, there'd been no chance they could have gotten out without that. So I think given the time, we have to be careful. So as terrible as that is, and climate and race are my two biggest issues. So I could go on and on about incarceration, all of this, police brutality. And I know that someone's going to try and lop my head off for forgiving the people who wrote the Constitution for that. But just look at the data on that. It's shocking that they got away with what they did. So yeah, I think it's important to realize.
Well, one thing you said to me before that I really liked was the name lobbyist. Didn't you say, didn't they used to have to stay in the lobby? Isn't that what you said?
Right. So first of all, I think it's important to realize what a lobbyist is. A lobbyist, by definition, is someone who's paid to go after the government for the reasons of the person who's paying them. So Jeff Bezos, who the way people define lobbyists in their mind, he's really the biggest lobbyist on earth, but by definition, he's not a lobbyist because no one's paying him to go after government. So the Kochs would, in my book, be the biggest lobbyists on earth, except no one's paying them. They're doing it with their money for free, and they're the ones hiring these lobbyists. Now, who are lobbyists? In most cases, they're all people who've been on the Hill for decades. So they really understand legislation. Remember, I said how hard it is to read legislation. So they're worth their weight in gold if you can read healthcare legislation and know who it's going to benefit. They're literally worth their weight in gold. So $250,000 easy if you're an issue specialist on a big issue. Which is why legislators, people are like, oh, the revolving door. And I'm like, yeah, but if we just think about them as not being corrupt, that's the best paying job they're going to get. They're issue specialists usually, and they understand legislative process. And they've kind of gotten used to being in DC, so they want to stick around, but they can't afford it. And so if we even look at it as a non-corrupt sense, the revolving door actually makes some kind of sense. Now, when I spoke to one, not the actual member of Congress, but his chief of staff, I showed him my work. He's like, the most dramatic effect is you'll kill K Street. He said that in 2 seconds. Because the last place, as you were getting to, is lobbyists who are basically reporting to these rich people, only make their money when they can influence legislation, right? And they're mercenaries, so they'll move around a bit. They'll even flip sides, right? So, and we think of it as really criminal, but again, they've got kids in school and people are paying them and they're doing everything by the letter of the law. So none of them are breaking law. Well, none.
Few.
The ideal lobbyists, and most of them are, there are actually a lot of people came to DC because they wanted to make the system better, than they had kids. And the real people that really corrupt legislation aren't the lobbyists because they really can't. They're acting like reporters, basically. So they go, oh, here's the legislation. Oh, that's going to affect Bezos. And they report back to Bezos because that's who hires them. Then Bezos goes, all right, so I'm going to send this dark money. I don't know if Bezos does this, but we know a lot of groups do this. I'm going to send this dark money to take that person out, the person who proposed that. Or I'm going to go after people in his coalition and make sure he can't pass legislation. And so the lobbyists aren't the ones that are doing the playing. The playing happens via the lobbyists as reporters. Now, tell me what a lobbyist is worth if they're left out in if they're left in the lobby. So the last place on earth that a lobbyist wants to be is in the lobby, trying to look through the keyhole, trying to figure out what's happening and who's deciding what. And so what happens, and we know it throughout history, if you close the door and leave them in the lobby, they go home. And a New York Times article from when they closed the doors on tax legislation in the mid-'80s, the '86 tax reform, they went around and started interviewing these guys because Rosenkowski said, I can't take it anymore. Too many lobbyists. We're closing the doors. All the lobbyists were supposed to wait there, right? Because they're lobbyists. The New York Times person's like, well, you guys are all packing your bags. You're all heading home. Guy turns around from an insurance organization, says, what do you want? Stick around and have them build our gallows? They're done. They're done. So historically, we know that, right? One of the biggest lobbyists in 1970 was Lewis Powell, working for a tax organization. He later became a Supreme Court justice because he was failing as a lobbyist. And he wrote in 1970, this is before they opened everything up, he wrote, the only thing government cares about are consumers and the environment. I dare you to try and be a lobbyist that gets something done. And
wow.
Money.
Before they opened up, right?
Right. He challenged people. He was like offended that people might think he's not good at what he's doing. But there's just no way to get it done. And so K Street didn't exist. Lobbying basically in DC didn't really exist. The amount of people that were hustling members outside of the doors was next to nothing. They don't want to be in the lobby. But as soon as they open those doors.
And again, this is opening doors on the committee meetings, right?
Right, because the final votes were already open. I think I skipped. So you want to take the NRA out, right? You do it in committee. How do you do it in committee? So the Republicans all hate the NRA. The left clearly hates the NRA. So you've got any committee, they're going to be happy to take the NRA out. How do you take the NRA out? You do the thing they hate the most, whatever it is, passing gun control legislation, defund them, change their tax status, whatever it is that you want to screw them on, and you package it with a must-pass spending bill in committee. And so even their base can't complain. Their base comes out, well, you did this against it. Well, I had to pass that funding for your bridge. Oh, of course we wanted the school milk program, right? You just package it. And
what's a must-pass funding? What's this about?
A must-pass. So every year there's a must-pass bill, and everyone tries to get their riders in on it, get their tags in on it, because you could basically put in anything. You could go, name my wife Satan because she divorced me, right? And that'll pass because it's a must-pass bill and it's 2,000 pages long. And no one's going to fault you for each line because there's too many things that the legislator can say, I did this for your community, right? There's too many goodies in there.
It's not good or bad. It's
right. So everyone's like, oh, they think every piece of legislation is a single issue piece of legislation, right? So the NRA would aggressively go after the 11 committee members if they just negated the thing in public, right? But they'd be like, somehow that ended up in the spending bill. Oh my God, you guys are now relegated to working only in Guam? Oh, I didn't know. Oh my God.
1,000 pages. I didn't see it.
And the history of this is forever, right? You look at Bill Packwood, who was there in the 60s and there in the 70s. And he's like, it was so easy before. The lobbyists or the special interests would come up to you and they'd be like, come on, go in there and go for it. He'd be like, of course I'm going in there. I'm going to fight like a tiger for you. Then he'd whisper to his committee chair. He's like, pretend I fought for you. Fought for these guys, right? He'd go out, oh my God, they killed me in there. They killed me. I couldn't get it done, right? And meanwhile, he's like voting, get these bastards out of here. So, yeah, I mean, these special interests are the ones who are the only people surrounding committees are special interests.
No
regulars. I've been in numerous committees, numerous important committees. It's 3 lobbyists, and then all the rest of the lobbyists are watching on C-SPAN. So if they need to, they're
like committee hearings and things that we see on C-SPAN. Is it all?
Well, almost all of them are televised now too, and you can see the amount of viewers, like 4 viewers, right? But it's someone going through fast forwarding because they don't publish all the committee votes that readily. You can go to the committee office and get the votes, but they're all televised. So lots on anything important, they'll have a little intern go through and watch the video, fast forward, and get all the votes, individual votes. When you're sitting in those committees, you'll see someone on their phone texting out all the individual votes to their boss. That's always going to be someone who's 25, who's getting paid like $30.
Oh, yeah.
To be a lobbyist assistant, right? It's not any real big players, and the committee rooms are generally empty, but they're following those votes. They want the exact decision, who did what. Because who is the most important? Because that's who you're going to invest in taking out, right? Anybody who offends your decision making.
And taking out pretty much means telling people that this person is someone you shouldn't trust. They don't care about you. Don't trust them.
You're going to run whatever negative ad works. If
a lot of it is like
and they're kind of a moderate or whatever, they can show pictures of Trump. They're going to do whatever it takes. If you wore an ugly swimsuit, they're going to run that photo. Whatever photo,
attack you.
They're going to come after you with negative ads. And everyone's all like, well, Citizens United allowed for unlimited legalized bribery. Citizens United was not a bribery case. That was an intimidation case. That was a negative ad, a feature-length negative ad taken out against Hillary. They weren't trying to put money into one person. They were trying to get rid of Hillary. I might even argue that the Citizens United ruling is maybe even okay if those committees are secret. There would be no money behind those ads if they couldn't target individual legislators. So people are all like, oh, Citizens United unleashed all the money. Well, if you look at the rise of campaign finance, which shoots up from basically the day they open all the committees, it goes up. I'm trying to do this so I'm pure. It goes up, wait. It goes up. I'm not coordinated. It goes up like this, right? It goes up. Citizens United's in the middle of that line. So sure, dark spending was authorized and made more available. So the rise in dark money. The amount of campaign finance does not significantly change with Citizens United. The thing that significantly changed campaign finance was the transparency. You close those doors, let billionaires spend all they want, they're not going to be spending a lot.
Because they don't know if it's effective.
Well, what's the worst thing you want to do? What if the person you're attacking is the only person that committee who's supporting you?
And you have no idea.
And they're all going to be telling you this. Well, of course, Charles. Come on, the Koch brothers, they're like blood to me, right? People are like, but they're lying. And I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, they're lying. And that's what you're supposed to do when people are trying to intimidate the crap out of you. If someone's like bullying you into a corner, you're going to say, hey, that's the police coming, and then you're going to run. Of course you're going to frickin' lie, and you better lie. And lie to these bastards because they deserve a good lie, right? People are like, oh, politicians should always tell the truth. I'm like, fuck no. You fucking lie your ass off to these special interests, and that's what they did, and it's clear.
Well, it's interesting. It's almost like they flipped. So before they were lying to the special interests and voting with
what we see in the data.
Now they're lying to the public and voting with the special interests.
And guess how much campaign finance they would raise at the end of the month? Woohoo! People were complaining about campaign finance in 1960s. You should see the numbers. It's almost like complaining about a puddle when when people are claiming there's a hurricane. I mean, it's just nothing. So the graph is flat. So people were complaining already in 74. They're like, what the hell is going on? The numbers are multiplying. It's been doing that ever since, right through Citizens United.
I mean, if I can track my investment, it's a lot easier than just throwing it into the wishing well and see what happens.
Exactly what it is. It's no investment when people, you're getting no good data. People are like, oh, well, the lobbyists figured all that out. I'm like, yeah, go talk to lobbyists as soon as they close the doors. They're all furious. And they're going home. And they're not going home because all of a sudden their life's easier with closed doors. They're going home because now they've got to go search for a new job.
When I've talked to some friends about this, it seems that we also, as normal citizens, want to lobby and have
everybody's a lobbyist in the Bezos and Koch sense, right?
But we just outmatched. We don't have the time or the money to do it, right? We think we can, but we don't. I don't even know that committee meetings really exist. So how do I
To be effective, and again, lobbyist is the wrong word, to be effective at influencing legislation, you have to be able to hire top-notch lobbyists who can read the legislation and know the little details, because if you change should to shall in a 1,000-page bill, that can move $1 million to your pocket. All right, or more, over many years, should to shall. So you need people that are so skilled, they've been living and breathing this, they can read that legislation, all 1,000 pages, they can read it in a day because these things turn around quick and get back to you with those should to shalls. Then you need to have the money and juice to be able to act quickly on it. And when I'm saying money and juice, you need to have, on the federal level, millions. And if you have millions, you can get that should change back to a shall, or the shall change back to a should. But as a personal citizen, you can't read that bill. You won't know what it means. You won't know that word change happened. And even if you do figure it out, and citizens never figure this stuff, they're all like, oh, I'll read legislation. I'm like, good luck, you idiot. I don't read legislation. This is all I do, right? So even if you figure it out, what are you going to do? Go change your vote? You're good. Okay, I'm going to switch my vote from Hillary to Trump because I lost $400 on tax. No. People think a vote is so powerful. It's horrible. It's really not a good tool at all. Your legislators won't know you switch for that reason. And usually you're going to switch from the frying pan to the fire, right? So it's like, oh, I'm going to vote. I'm like, yeah.
Well, and it's such a high level tool. It's not a detailed tool. Changing should to shall. That's a very specific detail. Whereas we vote at such a
right. And that's where Amazon is. That's where lobbyists are. They know that, God lives in the details. Or as someone said, you don't get killed by the bears, you get killed by the bugs, right?
It's probably some white guy in Africa.
It's the little stuff adding up that kills you, right? And
are there any people proposing or actively proposing what you're talking about with the closing of committee meetings to have more secrecy in there? I mean, besides you and
So we started this in 2014, where all I did was get laughed at. And then David King, the professor of Congress at Harvard, signed on with me. So now people stopped laughing as much. There was this one guy who would tweet me like, "You have nobody who supports you. No one's ever said this before." Daniel Schumann, complete idiot, still works in DC. He's the one who grabbed the mic out of my mouth. He works for pro-transparency groups. Hi, Daniel. Oh, by the way, you did suggest having me arrested for asking you for evidence to support transparency. But anyways, at that point, I would get nothing but embarrassed. I mostly didn't have answers to a lot of questions as well. So I was making some small mistakes. Mm-hmm. Then David signed on. I tightened my game. And even then, 2015, 2016 was a lot of reading. We in late November 2016, we did our first sort of public video on this. So David, Brent, and I had all been working on this. Brent's been phenomenal as well. Brent teaches sometimes at BC. He's about to put out a book on universal basic income. So we worked really hard on this, and then we put out that video with some of our general understandings early on. We introduced weaponized transparency, we introduced breweries, these ideas, but still very little support. It wasn't until 2019 when we published in Foreign Affairs that we saw sort of I wouldn't say a sea change, we saw a puddle change. So we published in Foreign Affairs, which is a big deal. Foreign Affairs is about as respected as it gets. We put out a great article. It became the #1 most read article for the next couple months. That was satisfying. Frances Lee, who has just got tenured at Princeton, brings it to a committee hearing in Congress for the change in Congress, and she basically knocks our article out of the park. Just beautiful. She nails it. Her 5-minute testimony was just like every important conclusion drawn as heavily as we want, except she said, "I'm just not sure if I would recommend this right now," right? She pulled back from going, "Absolutely have to do this." Said, accountability benefits the powerful. She said all this stuff. The wild thing was we had never had a legislator in the modern era talking about the problems of transparency. 4 of them spoke up, none of them against. 4 in support of what she said. 1 embarrassed the crap out of Daniel Schumann because he's talking about weaponized transparency. Daniel Schumann didn't even get it because he doesn't really study Congress. He's just so like a dog with a bone in his mouth pushing for transparency. And forget the guy's from Washington, really charming guy. He's talking about the problem of this, how everyone's taking pot shots at each other. He's talking about Democrats and Republicans doing this. Any solution for that, Daniel Schumann comes up with the stupidest answer. And the legislator just looks at him and is like, "You think that would fix something?" Like trying to be kind of nice. After that hearing, a number of scholars, and led by a few people whose names I'm not going to remember exactly, sent a letter to the committee saying, as one of their points, maybe we should close committee votes. That was the first time outside of my group that anyone had sent that. And those were 6 reasonable scholars had put their names on that. I sent that immediately to Norm. My God, Norm. I jumbled his name. The most popular political scientist. Maybe I'll send it in the notes and below. Whatever. I sent it as an email. He wrote back immediately. Goes, "Add my name to that list." Yeah, we got to close that. Our article got endorsed by the biggest scholar at Stanford, Fukuyama. Doesn't just retweet it, he endorses it. So he says this will stop lobbying and partisanship. So yeah, it's been great since then, and now we have sort of academic respect. I get invited every year to speak at West Point. I get introduced by the person who's saying this is the one thing that you will see in textbooks, and this will change things. And I now speak about here and there. Coronavirus squashed. We were building for a conference this month in March, and that disappeared. It was going to be funded and nice. So it's pretty sad because that was a big moment for us. So we're right in that process right now. And, now I basically get on Twitter every day and just kind of blast people because I know that we need to hit many different points to let people know. And I do pretty well. So when I speak with people in small groups, I do very well. I convert people fairly readily. As you saw at Represent.us, Represent.us is a pro-transparency organization. They put their political expert on the stage with us. So there's Larry Lessig, me, this other woman, and this guy. And even he later is just like, man, people loved what you said. And Larry's sort of playing pitbull for me. I'm saying something. He's trying to say something again. So Larry's just turning. And Larry was one of those who had been pro-bribery. He used to think bribery, and he's pulled back entirely from that. It's like bribery basically doesn't exist. But he hasn't really mentioned that intimidation is the main factor that we think it's that. So, no, it's not a sea change. We don't have – Larry hasn't endorsed it 100%. He's written me in emails. He said, you are correct. But he's not done it publicly, and there's a number of people. So I got an email through a friend. The main guy, Nolan McCarthy at Princeton, recommended my article to him and said, this is correct about partisanship. He's never said that publicly. So I don't really get it. I know that a lot of these guys are funded by Hewlett-Packard and these big funders who historically been pretty pro-transparency, so they might be fearful. So again, the public discourse is a problem. But who's really pushing it right now on Earth? A handful of people.
It shows me just what you're talking about in the dynamics, that they're willing to have these conversations with you privately, but publicly it's a different story. To commit to something publicly has many potential.
One of the most powerful academics on Earth, Steven Pinker, wrote me a private email. I doxed them. I put the email on our site, but that's not as, no one really follows me. If he would put that on his Twitter account, it would have been great. I don't think he really minds. It didn't sound like he was afraid. It's just not part of his agenda right now. I don't think he sees the subtleties of how important this is. But he wrote me directly. I mean, when I got an email from him came in, I just almost, my jaw dropped because he's really powerful. But he's done very little since on that. Fukuyama has mentioned problems with transparency before, but he really enjoyed that we had taken it to the level that we did. And then, of course, Francis Lee bringing that up in front of Congress. Like, I didn't want to watch that hearing because I thought it was going to be a nightmare for me because it had 3 panelists, pro-transparency panelists, and then Francis Lee, who I'd gone back and forth with, and she'd never been very clear. And I started getting texts, and they're like, oh, my God, Francis Lee is there for you, right? Yeah, we watched that, and she's killing it. And the big thing I think she says that's really important to me is all accountability benefits the powerful. So people love this word accountability, but it throughout history, accountability has always benefited the most powerful people. Whoever can pick up the stick and do the whacking.
It benefits the most powerful people the most. So it can benefit
well, sometimes the people are the most powerful on very rare issues. So there's you might get one issue every 4 years where the people are the most powerful player.
Yeah.
But that's so rare. In general, the most powerful is going to be the special interest who can move votes on their particular little tax break.
So occasionally some people make some money at the blackjack table, but the house always wins.
It's not the bears that'll kill you, it's the bugs.
Oh, man. And you know what I like about this is it's a simple, elegant solution. I mean, how much would it cost? How much money would it cost to change this?
$5?
To print the paper, maybe?
I call it the cardboard box reform. You put a cardboard box with even just one hole in it, right? Aristotle developed this. And you put 2 urns. You put a blue urn and a yellow urn. And then you have a blue ball and a yellow ball, where blue might mean no and yellow means yes. So if you put the blue ball in the blue urn and the yellow ball in the yellow urn, that's a yes vote. If you flip it, and you might have something tactile, like little things sticking out on the blue ball, so you know what it is. So you stick your hand in with both balls, and you're supposed to juggle them and then put them on. Leave the cameras rolling. You have a perfect secret ballot today. Despite all the cell phones, you empty the urns out, and you just go, okay, in the blue, how many are yellow? And that's against, and how many are for? And then you have the parity count, because you'd empty the yellow, the number should be the same. So setting that up would cost just a few bucks. The other nice thing is, supported by the Constitution, Article 1, Section 5 allows for a secret Congress, and it's also a rules change, so it wouldn't require even going through the Senate. The House could change.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Doesn't need presidential approval.
So this would change just the House?
Right. You can change all the House committees, and the Senate can change all the Senate committees.
And the Senate could change their own as well without having to go through, yeah.
And you almost never have to speak to a legislator more than about 2 minutes on this. Like I said, I've been hugged by members, right? One member hugged me and said, we've got to change this. I can't talk about it, but I get it. They get it right away. They know how big a problem it is right away. their terror is the public perception on this, right? Everyone right now has been sold mostly by the Kochs and Bezos. Bezos buys the Washington Post, the most important paper in DC, in 2017, adds the tagline, "Democracy dies in darkness," when he was under fire by congressional committees. So think about how insane that is. The most powerful people, Koch, support transparency groups. These guys are fully supporting transparency groups. And the more we look, the more insane it is, right? You're like, oh, Democracy Forum is supporting that transparency group. That's the head of eBay, right? Like, it's endless.
Democracy dies in darkness and business thrives in it.
No, well, yeah, and what we say is
the imbalance of transparency, right?
Because this has always done one thing: democracy has always thrived in darkness. Yeah. So democracy was saved in 1890 by the secret ballot. Saved. I mean, it was done. It was as bad as today times 10. And they introduced the secret ballot, and man, there was nothing but birds singing. You clean everything up right away, and inequality didn't start dropping, but it flatlined. And then between FDR and the New Deal, inequality started shooting down like a stone. Partisanship shooting down, all these things.
I think a lot of us get this on a visceral level just from our own lives, you know? When we're trying to make a difficult decision, to try to do that in public and share all the things that we're going through.
You talk about your kid in front of them about everything. Like if, you think they might need special help or whatever, you're going to talk privately, right? Because you want the best for them and you want them to be confident going forward. And a lot of times you might even be wrong, right? Mm-hmm. You might think your kid has a problem. And I've got a son. I've thought this many times. And, he's like, oh, he's talking funny. He might have a speech impediment. A month later, he doesn't have it, right? So glad I'm not like pestering him with all of that. I bounce it off his mom, who usually goes, "You're crazy and neurotic." And that discussion's great, right? But she's then now made aware of it and she'll mention it to me later. And we've had this with a number of issues that have just disappeared. And we haven't provided any extra neurosis on him. So
it's trusting people to figure out a solution instead of surveilling them and trying to watch over their shoulder everything they do.
But again, and if you don't trust them and you're not watching, the powerful people take the accountability. The word accountability and government, you go on Google Ngram, you see transparency and accountability shoot up around that time too. No one was even using it. They weren't like, oh, I need to hold my member accountable. I'm like, no, you don't. No one talks about that. No one even, what do you mean accountable? We don't even use that with government. Transparency, that's for window.
What's accounting used for? Tracking investments.
No one was using the word. Don't try and find a line that says government and accountability before 1980. Not easy. Transparency. So the biggest scholar at the time, Princeton, is writing about the problems of transparency in 1990. He doesn't use the word transparency in his book because it's new. He was using the word traceability. Like, who would use that now? It's just retarded. So this is the hard part, is doing research, right? You got to figure out what words they're trying to use for this stuff, because they weren't using these new words. And then we have a big scholar, congressional scholar, Jacqueline Kalmus, who now writes about the presidency. She wrote, and I'm still pestering her for references on this, but she wrote, all the people who got pushed out, all the lobbyists by the 1986 tax reform, the 1990 Clean Air Acts, became the big proponents of transparency. And we know folks started funding some of the big scholars at that time, that exact year. We know that these big scholars won the Nobel Prize. And keep in mind, these Swedes are fucking weird. They've always supported market-based solutions to government. So they've given awards to some of the most nefarious economists. They give the award to James Buchanan, who's basically pushing vote trading and vote selling. In 1986, he wins the Nobel Prize for this. And right in the introduction to the Nobel Prize, they go, he's added a market-based approach to government. And I'm like, yeah, he did. That's corrupt. That's vote selling. And he writes it straight up in his early papers. Vote selling's key. Vote trading is key. So this is the long story I could go into, but it starts with a paper in 1959 written by a guy named James Tulloch, who puts, if legislators can trade votes, that means someone who's very interested and has a lot to trade can get the legislation they want. The only way around this would be if Congress voted secretly, which at that time they were most.
He wrote that. The only way around.
Wrote that. James Gordon Tullock. This work led to so he partnered with James Buchanan. Then they write Public Choice. It dominates. So you have the big scholars today, Tyler Cowen, all this, who are public choice economists. It's not economy. This is how to capture government. So it's just a big fraud, and it's all built. Their entire foundation is built on the ability to trade votes. Does anyone trade votes with someone who has nothing to offer? No, they don't. Trade, you can trade one vote for 50 votes. You can trade one vote for $50. You can trade one vote for $5 million. You can trade one vote for your reelection. You can trade one vote for not getting killed, right? So as soon as you trade, you've added a market aspect to government. That's the one thing government cannot be. As soon as it's market, you start getting empires.
Isn't the point of government to often regulate the markets? Right? To make sure you
Nobel Prize in economics. Now, keep in mind, the descendants of Alfred Nobel hate the economics prize because it wasn't set up by him.
Really?
Yeah, it's extra Nobel Prize put together with money and funded and often controversial. And so you don't have to go too far. Go to Wikipedia on the Nobel Prize in economics, and they'll talk about Hayek and Friedman winning these things. They don't really mention Buchanan because they haven't figured it out. But a big book came out a few years ago called Democracy in Chains, and she basically Nancy McLean points at Buchanan as the reason the right's been able to take over, except Nancy McLean leaves out one thing. She doesn't know what the cause is. She doesn't know that at the center of it and in his biggest documents is vote trading and log rolling his vote trading and the ability to sell votes. That's the foundation of public choice economics. So, and 1959, so keep in mind, 1966, they start the journal. 66 is the first year Republicans start proposing for these votes to be open in committee. So they want electronic votes and all this. By 1970, it passed with no public pressure whatsoever. We knew at that point they were already being funded. These academics were being funded by big oil companies. So, yeah, this is a story you haven't heard. Why? Because this is our work. This is what we do. We're still trying to publish that, but I'm putting it out there too. But you've never heard this story, but it's all verifiable. You can go download Gordon Tullock's 1959 paper right now. What's the name of the paper? The Problem with Majority Voting, i.e., how can I get minorities to win the vote? And he wasn't.
The problem with majority.
He wasn't. I don't think Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan were, as many people suggest, out racist. But they certainly had no problem with using a few racist angles to get their work forward. And if you look at Tullock's paper, it's the most ridiculous shit I've ever seen, right? So he's coming up with an example. He's like, all right, so, I want the rich to be able to trade votes. How am I going to sneak it in there? Well, these liberals really like minorities, racial minorities, and Jews. And so he's like, oh, let me color it with an example. Say there was a bill in the legislature to send all blacks and all Jews back to their respective countries. This is his little example. It's like, well, of course that might pass, which would be really terrible. But it wouldn't be able to pass if the votes were open, and then the black groups and the Jews would be able to trade votes to stay in the country. And I'm like, except the opposite's happening in government right now. We're passing some of the best civil rights legislation in history in closed doors. The Civil Rights Bill passed simply because LBJ kept everything closed. One of the members of Congress said in the 2019 hearing, black member said, oh shit, yeah, civil rights would not have passed if that was discussed in public at the time, because the U.S. was a bunch of fucking racists. The shelter was the government. And so this is the little example he's using.
Well, it's an example saying that you, the people, have the power.
He's basically saying that all whites hate all blacks and all Jews. And of course, if a bill was proposed to get rid of these minorities, all the whites, of course, vote for it. I'm like, No, we're not a bunch of fucking pitchfork holding baboons, right? We're thoughtful. The legislature, actually, these people run for office because they love America, all of them, and they want to build the city on the hill, and they're being terrorized by all these special interests.
Fascinating. They call what did you say, the problem with majority voting?
Majority voting. That's a big problem. You got to watch out for that majority voting problem.
But isn't I'd argue most of the government, if not all of it, built on majority voting?
Well, called democracy, but but again, just a sentence that introduces the 1986 Nobel Prize. We're giving this Nobel Prize to James Buchanan. They didn't give it to Tulloch because Tulloch hadn't graduated with a PhD, right? So even though they co-authored the big book on public choice, so they're like, we're an elitist faction and we're a bunch of millionaires, and oh, this is fantastic. He's added a market approach to government. Market, vote trading approach to government. And that's in the very first line. That's what he wins the Nobel Prize for. That is the foundation for one of the major goings-ons in academia. So George Mason University, universities all over being funded by the Kochs and all that to promote public choice economics. And it's all built on this one little thread of open voting in legislatures. You close that, the entire argument is worth nothing. And that is, by definition, it allows for vote buying. So that is a market. It is definitely a market. And I don't see too many papers from them coming out like stating this clear, vote buying is good, right? Because everybody knows that vote buying is shit. And so they use all these sort of liberal, oh, we're going to protect the Jews and blacks by having this. And I'm like, no, they would have gotten totally screwed if it was open voting, right? And it was the Supreme Court who was fully protected from all the racist loons, which aren't the majority anywhere. From the South, a lot of thoughtful, wonderful Republicans and people in the South just get overshadowed by all these nut jobs. But the Supreme Court voted undecided, unanimously in Brown versus Board of Education in '56. That threw Tulloch for a loop. That pissed him off, pissed Buchanan off, and they used that to get funding. Government's taking all our rights away. We're states' rights. Whenever you hear states' rights, just rewrite races.
It's interesting that the Supreme Court is incredibly secretive in their deliberation process.
Yeah, but they're kind of public as well, so we know how they vote. But they are
in their vote and in their dissent.
Right. But yes, their deliberations are fully secret. And Scalia spoke out very wonderfully against this. So he wrote this when they were trying to push televisions on the Supreme Court. He wrote the most beautiful paper on that, basically saying, yeah, we'd be destroyed. We'd be destroyed as a group. So, but they vote publicly. But keep in mind that they're the most protected, we could call them a legislature on earth. You're not going to take them out in the next election. Right? You're never going to take them out. And so once they're in, yeah, they are nervous. They don't want the public to hate just them. Nobody wants to be shamed endlessly in public. But they are protected.
Well, they are protected, but their friends and family aren't.
Oh, that's absolutely not true. The Supreme Court does have some protections. And I don't know if you saw recently, I think it was a year ago, an appellate court woman, a gunman showed up after she made a decision and started shooting at her husband. Her son jumped in the way and the person shot her son and killed him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And she started talking about how we need protection all the way down the line. And we do. I mean, that's just, so whenever, so you have the recent, you have this recent decision by the court in Kentucky that favored the cop who shot. And keep in mind that a lot of these judges now are elected officials who live in these communities. Madison spoke very seriously about expanding the whole, having legislators from all over so that they wouldn't be terrorized by the locals. right? So if you've got someone in Hawaii voting on a rabid bunch of ridiculous cops in Kentucky, the person in Hawaii is going to feel a little bit easier voting, right? So when you have the local guys voting on the local people, Italy knows this well, right? The more local it is, the more it's going to favor, the people who did the crimes, right?
Well, so Madison spoke about this?
His big deal was expand the whole. Thomas Jefferson famously wanted small central government. Madison argued for the big federal government. This is an eternal argument. And his big line was expand the whole, make it broad. And one of the reasons was you'd have less local intimidation. So if that court that decided in that case, and I'm bad with names, so Breonna
Taylor.
Breonna Taylor. So I actually want to say, I just don't want to say it wrong. If that was decided in so many other places, that decision would have been very different. But I want to say not the DA, the Attorney General is an elected position there. Crazy. And these people, so we see that all the time. So incarceration rates have been soaring, all of this, but these judges are elected in many places. And part of their campaign is to show that they're much tougher than the other guy. They put many more people in jail than the other guy. Everybody loves that, right? We're going to be tough on crime. So it's always worked. And so the more open the process is, the more people go to jail. And yeah, just like anything else, the incarceration rate had been dropping for decades. Hits an all-time low in early 1970s. They're having discussions in DC about getting rid of all prisons. Federal prisons, gone. We don't need them. We can reform, everything will be great. And then past every country on it. So this moves me. I mean, each day when I go, I'll just take a rest on doing this research or doing PR. That I'd say that one issue moves me more than any other. And which is why I laud Trump. Trump's the only Republican who's so unfazable by public pressure that he can go after incarceration rates and try and lower them. Right? Any other Republican would have been under fire. No one's going to go, oh, Trump, a little wuss, right? So he's remarkably able to do that as a president. Now, presidents aren't the most powerful individuals. You need to move Congress to get stuff through. And there's a guy named Neustadt, which is why the debate today might not be as important as people like to think. He says presidents really don't have power. And if you look at Trump, that's fairly true. Trump ran on a number of things. Ban Obamacare. I'm going to put up a wall. We're 4 years later. You had a Republican Congress. Where's the wall? This powerful president. He wasn't big on providing tax breaks to the rich. In fact, he was against it. We got tax breaks for the rich. People are like, oh, Trump's running everything. It's going to be the Trump economy. It's like, presidents aren't that powerful. And if we go back through history, you see it. So if you look at inequality, it goes up despite the president, almost linearly. So people are like, oh, Reagan, he drove inequality. No, it jumped up right before he got in office.
When you talk about the negative advertising, is that going after judges as well, too?
Oh, yeah. You probably live in a place where judges aren't elected.
They are. No, they're elected.
Okay. Yeah. Then you'll follow it. And you'll see it's almost always how tough are they.
Interesting. It's calling them a wuss. That's right.
It's what's your record on putting people behind bars? Because everyone's like, oh, those prisons, they've lobbied, and that's why everyone's in jail. Prisons do lobby, but they're around 25 million a year. They aren't very good lobbyists. It's the real problem here is that every legislator knows that the people will excoriate you if you vote to be soft on crime. Because every poll ever taken of the people says that the people misunderstand crime rates in the neighborhood. Every person, not just grannies, but every Joe Schmo thinks crime is 10 times worse in the neighborhood, not 10 times, but some significant number. And so if a legislator looks to defund and then one person goes out and holds up a convenience store, that will be the ad in the next election.
Because it's so emotionally traumatizing.
Right. There's not a lot of issues you'll lose the election over for one stupid ad that's not based on data, but crime will be it. Right? You're not going to lose on trade. You're not going to lose on whether scuds are hitting things. You're not going to lose even on 9/11, but you will on crime. Right? Oh, you changed the education stuff. Well, people are all upset. Crime's worse. And that incarceration is true. There's not a single legislator, not a single one in DC who's right there going, we spend way too much on jails and prisons. I would kill to have that money in the budget to do something else. Or if you're a real hardcore Republican, I would look to axe it. Every single one of them across the board right now is sitting there going, that's the biggest waste on our lines of budget.
Private.
They would axe it tomorrow if they were able to do so without being blamed for it.
Yeah. So who needs to be convinced to change this?
I do it one at a time. That's how I'm working, right?
Well, that's how it works, right? It's
do it one at a time. I tweeted an Obama speechwriter. You know, I tweet whoever randomly based on keywords. He wrote back, "Oh my God, I'm 100% with this," and I'm going to retweet it later today. It's insane. He gave me this insane story of how this happened, you know, and he's just like, this is just
because so citizens don't know what it's like to feel that level of intimidation.
Right. And Democrats don't know it either. But
fear and pain and trauma from what happened.
Democrats don't know it either. And what's crazy is everyone says bribery, but bribery is so low, so low that death threats are far more common than bribery, far more common. So some legislators, AOC probably gets death threats every day. She gets some public death threats. And we don't make a big deal of this in the press, surprisingly, and Congress never makes a big deal of it. But these people get arrested and put in jail. So what's crazy is most people don't even know this exists. But there's an ongoing task force that goes after verifiable death threats on legislators. And they put these MFs in jail. Now, the legislator's not going to go, oh, that put him in jail because he terrorized me, right? They don't like to look like they're being wimps. And then the press just doesn't cover it because no one's talking about it. But she got a death threat from a policeman, right? A public death threat. Now that guy's in trouble, right? You know, it is what it is. She gets death threats all the time. I've spoken to her staffers. She gets death threats all the time. So everyone's like bribery. And I'm talking like death threats is a real issue. And way beyond death threats are the amount of financial entities that are come after you to try and take you out, using threats as well, but also taking you out with negative ads. So here's grand scale corporate intimidation. Here's death threats. And keep in mind, 2 legislators in the last 10 years, federal legislators, caught bullets. 1 Republican, 1 Democrat. They caught bullets. Others have been fired at. 60 rounds, Democrat guy with a gun, real Democrat, shooting the hell out of a Republican softball team, caught Scalise in the back. Kathy Giffords, might be getting her name wrong. She's now big anti-NRA, point blank, a bullet in her head for positions like that. So intimidation's really there. Bribery is like, I don't know if there's a case of bribery on anything that people care about at all. So healthcare, bribery. Show me any case where someone's attempted bribery, even an indictment for it. I don't think they exist. So usually when you see bribery in Congress, it's always going to be like, you know, my cousin had a dock. I could change the zoning. I put in the proposal, and you know, he gave me a car. Right? It's petty corruption that honestly doesn't hurt a lot of people. It's still corruption. You should still be in jail. But when people say bribery, they are talking out of their butthole that it's driving anything. And it's been nice to see people change their views on it, at least in academia.
Well, and I mean, you talk about the death threats. I mean, how many of us can relate to that? I mean, people who are more public figures, yes, but people who aren't.
Death threats, you know, you death threat a legislator, they're going to come after you. many cases, they're death threatening their children, as you suggested earlier.
Yeah.
Oh, they take that so seriously. People are like, oh, that doesn't really happen in the U.S. It's happening today.
Oh,
Trump probably received death threats today. Biden probably received death threats today. Kamala Harris, because she's a minority, probably 10 death threats, right?
Mhm.
It's happening today. The poor woman, one member of Congress voted against Bush to go at war with Iraq after 9/11. She said her death threats could be piled up as tall as she was, the letters. That's back when they sent those letters.
And that's just death threats, which is
right. On an issue where the people will want to admit they were all wrong.
Yep.
On an issue where all the people, both right and left, will admit they are wrong.
But that's just the most extreme form of intimidation. But there's all the little forms.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, people say bribery, I go death threats.
Yeah.
Then they go bribery, I go now real intimidation, negative ads. And the most important use of this, so when we look at brewery, the most important people like money. It turns out that the wealthy actually don't, intimidation's free, right?
Yeah.
So if you're walking down the street and I want your milk and I'm bullied, I'm usually not going to have to hit you for it. I just say, give me that or I'll hit you. And you're like, I can take my milk. That cost me nothing, right? This is how special interests work as well. That we know, if you're a legislator, that if you vote against the NRA, the negative ads will come. As a result, they don't have to run many negative ads. Every 4 or 5 years, some legislator tries it, and the negative ads come in. And they love when it happens on the state level because the ads are so much cheaper. And
local TV.
On the state level with the NRA, they're going to pour, this massive sum of $80,000 to take you out. And $80,000 on many state races will take you out. And the success rate is great for the NRA on that. And think of the national exposure for $80K. Okay, so everyone's like, oh, they've got all this money, they're blowing everyone. No, they're very budget conscious. Israel does this well. I don't say Israel, the country, the Israel lobby is famous for this. Look at Pelosi, look at anyone, right? The only thing all legislators agree on is how wonderful and strong our ties are with Israel. And I'm like, yeah, because there is no meaner and more aggressive lobby group. Like, I'm surprised they haven't even come after me yet. They are famous for taking out academics. They are famous for taking out legislators. And you have legislators who've written books on this. Those books are hard to find. You can find them online, but you're not going to find them in the bookstore. So Charlie Finley is his name, wrote, They Dare Speak Out, and accumulated all these legislators who were under fire. So Israel basically runs what I would call the perfect way to control legislation. And most groups follow their pattern in some form or way. So the Koch brothers have aggressively used that. NRA uses that. Big Pharma does that. Oil uses that. So, Israel's just good. They're bright, right? They really know how to do this. And the stories are insane.
It's this chill. Don't they call it a chilling effect, where you try to?
But think about Israel. Right? Israel's a tiny country of 7 million people with a lot of finances in the U.S. I think there's something like in New York City, 25% of all the people in New York City at the turn of the century were Jewish, right, and had come through the Exodus and all of this. But here's a group, and keep in mind that Jews in the United States are not super supportive of the Israel lobby, just as gun owners in general aren't supportive of the NRA, just as people who use oil aren't very supportive of the oil companies, right? But this little lobby can take the U.S. and kind of use it as a gun. They can use this big country use as a gun. We're just going to point over here and shoot it at our enemies, right? Or threaten, or the U.S. is very important to the defense and Israel. So,
I was thinking about, what did I watch a couple of years ago? There was a special about Thanksgiving and how the first Thanksgiving actually happened and the people who came over. And when they arrived, it was actually winter time and only half of them actually survived the boat. And then when they landed, they were like, and they were scholars and religious people. They didn't know how to survive too much in the
1609.
What's up?
That was 1609, right?
Yeah. And they didn't know really how to survive in the wilderness with all this and that. And I remember it said that at one point when they interacted with the natives, they chopped off one of the guy's heads and put it on a stake outside of their camp to warn others not to. And I was like, wow, that's terrorism. I mean, it's terrorism. It's
That's what they do now. They take out a legislator. You take one out and everyone gets quiet.
Yeah.
And you don't have to kill them.
Terrified.
It's much better if you don't kill them. You take them out. It's political. It's a bloodless political assassination. You take them out in the primary. The primaries are really cheap. And that's what the oil companies focus on, primaries. And
cheap and embarrassing. It's embarrassing to lose a primary.
yeah, I don't think they're worried about the embarrassment. Mostly they're just bitter and confused, right? Look at Bob Inglis, who I just really adore. This guy, Republican, who's still pushes hard for climate solutions. He got primaried by Tea Party, which is basically the oil companies.
Didn't you say they coined it being like anglicized or something to get English?
Oh, right. I didn't coin that. That's I want to say Sherrod Brown, but I probably got his name wrong. One of the Democrat senators wrote a book about a lot of this intimidation that's being used. The book's called Captured, and it's kind of a shame that he never really understood that the transparency is a matter. But he talks a lot about brewery, which is this how to take people out. You don't give people money, but yeah, he said they got English, and the senators would talk about that, and it was provides a real chill. So even in the not the European Union, what is it? Where do they do all the climate accords? What the hell? Oh my God. So focused on the U.S. It's like the most famous international body.
No, my brain's fading right now.
Well, but they also switched to open voting as well. And so the climate accords are open voting. And if you watch Al Gore juggling and trying to get these votes, you can see that the leaders are very terrified of the pressures back at home, just as Kennedy was or Khrushchev was, worried about the home pressures, right? And so people are pulling out of these accords. If those votes are secret, just like Kennedy and just like Khrushchev, yeah, we don't want the world to be melted.
Are there any countries that do this well that you've seen in terms of having like the secret deliberation process? And
every country, every single one has only moved towards more transparency. And so we've seen worsening things. But the European Union is more secret. And as one scholar readily said, more secret means less lobbyists. And they have little tricks to pull off a little bit more secrecy. And so they're more able to pass some climate accords. But keep in mind that there's been massive pressure. And I'm trying to remember the guy's name who wrote for Politico. He actually interviewed me. But he was finding that the only people pushing for transparency were the corporations.
Mm.
So they're trying to open them up, right? So transparency's only been on an upswing. As my friend says, I think he's from your neck of the woods, from Milwaukee, he says, I hope we're at peak transparency. I hope so too, but unfortunately it's what you see. The Committee to Modernize Congress, after listening to 4 members complain about transparency, after listening to the scholar complain about transparency, after the 3 pro-transparency advocates, Daniel Schumann et al., having nothing to say, the Modernization Committee proposed, and getting the letter from those scholars, a public letter saying, please close those committees. They have not mentioned a thing. So they just put out their proposals, has nothing to do with closing doors, because they're terrified. Right? If you're a legislator and you go out and you say, I think my vote should be secret. Oh yeah, you criminal.
Because
it's very similar to the crime issue, right? The people's perception is way off from reality. So there's 3 issues where the people actually drive the policy in a bad way. So incarceration rates, it's the public that drives that. So everyone's like, the people know better on everything. No, they don't. They're wrong on a number of things. They're really wrong in crime, and we know that. The data's in. They're always wrong about crime rates. They're really bad on nuclear power as well. So if you're a climate person, you look at nuclear as being the staple right now because renewables just aren't that great.
Mm-hmm.
And modern nuclear is really incredible. You go and take the old waste from another one, you stiff it in your new thing, you get 10 times more power, and the waste is 10 times cleaner. So modern nuclear is really great, and it lowers your carbon footprint almost immediately. The public doesn't know this at all. I don't care. It's hard to find 3 Democrats in a row who might go, oh, nuclear is really helpful. It's changed somewhat. We've moved, but Germany got really bad, and they've been closing down nuclear for the same reason. And France, they're like, oh, nuclear is the worst thing in the world. Like, no, it might save your butt. So they're wrong there, and they're wrong on transparency and accountability. So those are the areas where the public is actually so wrong that they are messing the earth up really bad, really bad. So closed committees protect us from our idiocies, just like with the Iraq War, right? If that had been a closed vote, I have a feeling it would have been much more hardcore against Bush and the goofiness of going into an untested area and creating a war.
Well, it prevents us from activating some of these biases that we have. You know, intuition is not always right. Right.
And Madison and Hamilton talked about, they looked at the Senate as a cooling body to cool the fire of the people. These are people who, you know, legislators get more data. Lobbyists are helpful in that regard, right? As long as a lobbyist can't say do this or else, as in they can't see what you're doing, can provide great information. In many ways, I can be considered a lobbyist. No one pays me to do this, but I knock on doors. I walk into members of Congress doors. A lot of times I don't even knock. And they're quite happy to see me, and I'll chat with them. So I'm pushing my agenda. People go, oh, who's funding you? I'm like, yeah, you like to look at funding all the time. Well, that's how you judge somebody. Why don't you read the ideas? Oh, but who's funding you? I'm like, nobody, bitch.
but who would? I mean,
I should be funded. There's people like Daniel Steed at Hewlett Packard, if they weren't a bunch of billionaires, would likely fund a group like ours. They're funding all these pro-transparency groups, and I've written him, and he's fairly thoughtful, Daniel, but he refuses to acknowledge that they're basically pushing transparency, and they're pushing it hard. I go to these meetings, and all the people who are fighting me are funded by him. So the Hewlett Packard Foundation funds a lot of democracy groups. Then almost all the others, all the big ones, Democracy Fund, all of this, they're funding transparency groups. Google funds transparency camps, Microsoft transparency camps, and all makes sense, right? There's nothing wrong. You've never seen a powerful special interest complain about transparency. Never, not once. It's supposed to be watching them. We're supposed to be putting them in check, and never, not once have one of these groups complained about it.
They're funding government and congressional transparency, not transparency, because they're not funding their own transparency. This is the thing that really
right. Corporate so that's corporate versus government. Right. So yeah, they
by focusing the attention on how opaque somebody else is, they
and
from how opaque they are.
There's a cool scholar, James Marquand, who talks about how we use transparency as a weapon around the world. So if we have troubles with Iran, any deal we broker with Iran is going to involve us being able to see more about them. It's not going to be a buy, so if you want to weaken somebody, you push them into the open. And if you look at the demise of labor, they've done a lot of that to try and push open committee meetings of labor groups and all of that. And then they run all their ads.
I think sometimes we do this just from a personal standpoint. In somebody hurts us, and then we want to watch them so they don't hurt us again.
Transparency is great.
Somebody cheats on us. Okay, well, we want to monitor where they're going all the time. Well, that just means they're probably going to cheat on you again, or you're going to see something and misconstrue it, and your trust.
Well, I think you're making a crazy stretch, but but
I do that a lot.
But yes, power and pushing transparency outward has always been important, but not transparency inward.
Oh yeah, I want you to be open and honest with me. I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing. I just want to know everything you're doing.
And it's tough because
information asymmetry is powerful.
If you want to sell an article, you put the word secret in it, and people go, "Oh, it's secret," and now I'm getting to learn. I'm going to be on the inside, right? And so we have this natural thing about secrecy. Like if you've got a neighbor who's got their curtains down all the time, and every time they leave, they cover their heads and go into the car, that's the only neighbor everyone's going to be concerned about.
Yeah.
Right. And then you've got the other neighbor who's got glass windows and they're walking around naked. You're going to be like, please put curtains up. Right. Yeah. So it's secrecy that we're obsessed with. Right. We aren't,
But not corporate secrecy?
Oh, people want it, but it's not necessarily legal or right to do. Right. You don't have a right to tell people. So even with government, we're like, oh, we're going to push more transparency. So we should put Trump's travel itinerary day to day, so every gunman on earth can know where he is each and every moment. No, you're not going to get. You can't walk into the bathroom with a legislator whenever you want. You can't get their house address. There's a lot of secrecy we're just really willing to accept, and where we draw that line, I think it's important. People accept a ton of secrecy, right? Mm-hmm. We call it the Secret Service for a reason, right? No one's like, oh my God, they're secret, right? Open it all up. Yeah, I want to see the parade route. I want to know exactly what second Trump is passing in front of that building with his head outside of the window, right? No, we don't give that information out. And yes, that's fine. Because we know what it'll lead to. It'll lead to more than intimidation. It'll lead to death. So yeah, there's people are like, well, our government's too secret. It's like still the most open institution and legislature on earth. And it didn't used to be, and it was working a lot better before.
Oh man. Well, I appreciate you. I'm getting tired.
Yeah, I'm starving.
James, thanks for joining. I hope if people were watching live, they appreciate it. If not, you can check it later, and hopefully we'll try to get some of these references in the show notes.
Yeah, I feel like it's more like, hey, we got more stuff on the record, like for the person who's going to dig in 2 years from now when this actually might become more popular. Because
that's the thing for me. A lot of this is, having the conversations that I want to have. And then if other people want to listen to them, great. If not, then we can refer to them in a couple of years. Because
And for me, I look at these opportunities as like, wow, I can't publish everything. It's just too much time. So I'm going to dump all this new research on the world. And, you want to find it, it'll be there.
Amen.
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Great questions. And you provided a really amazing engagement for those 2 hours and 21 minutes, that's Joe Rogan style.
Hey, it's there's room enough for more than one Joe, I guess, right?
Yeah. Hopefully you hit the record button.
I hope to, right? It's one of those, did I hit the right button? Oh goodness.
Jim, hope to see you soon. Hopefully we'll make some apple danishes or something.
Going after the Michigander in me, apple Danish. Hey, great seeing you, James, and take care. Love you, man.
Bye.